Welcome, friends. Thank you for joining me in this exploration of spiritual strongevity, the formation of life over time in the presence of God. In this brief reflection, we're going to look at two men from the New Testament who walked in close proximity to Jesus, Paul and Judas. Paul and Judas help us see that spiritual formation is not shaped in a single dramatic moment, but instead through the quiet weight of repeated return, what we trust, where we go under pressure, and what becomes our center. So, as we walk through these slides, this is not merely a comparison of two historical biblical figures. It is an invitation for you and me to examine our own trajectory, our own spiritual event horizon, because the direction we practice becomes the direction that carries us. Let's begin. The title of this presentation is Paul and Judas, Two Spiritual Event Horizons. Two men walked in close proximity to Jesus. Both were serious, intelligent, and entrusted with responsibility. Yet over time, their lives moved in opposite directions. Now, this is not merely a story about these two individuals. It is a revelation of how spiritual formation actually works. Both men were near Jesus. Both were entrusted with responsibility. Both were exposed to truth. Judas walked with Christ during his earthly ministry, while Paul encountered the risen Christ on the Damascus Road. So the issue before us is not access, not intelligence, and not religious seriousness. Proximity to truth does not guarantee transformation. Spiritual formation happens through repeated pattern and repeated return. Small choices made over time accumulate weight. Eventually, they form a growing reflex, the direction we move, without thinking, when pressure comes. Under stress, we do not invent a response, we follow our formation. Judas developed a pattern of hidden self-interest. He managed the common purse and quietly helped himself to what was inside of it. This behavior required rationalization and control on his part, and because it was formed in secret, it grew without interruption. The outer life remained religious, but the inner trajectory was shifting. When pressure came, Judas moved toward self-preservation. Betrayal was not a sudden accident. It was the natural outcome of his practiced direction. His remorse did not lead him back to Christ. Instead, it turned inward and collapsed. Control carried him, because control, rather than dependence, was what he had repeatedly trusted. Paul's life moved in the opposite direction. He practiced repeated surrender. He embraced weakness rather than hiding it. And through that weakness, he learned dependence upon Christ. He could say that God's grace was sufficient for him, and he could say that divine power was made perfect in weakness. And he did say these things. Now, when Paul experienced pressure, he moved toward prayer. And when he faced uncertainty, he moved toward trust. This pattern did not arise in a moment. It was formed through repeated dependence. So, when crisis came, surrender carried him, because surrender had become his reflex. We see two different centers of gravity here. In Judas, the self was the center. In Paul, Christ was the center. And whichever center holds the weight determines the direction of the life. A spiritual event horizon is not a single dramatic moment. It is a consolidated direction formed over time. It is the point at which trajectory begins to carry us. What we have repeatedly trusted becomes our automatic response. I wish to read Galatians 2:20 in its entirety now. Here it is. I have been crucified with Christ, and I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. The life I now live in the body, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. So these are words from Paul, and they are perhaps the clearest possible articulation of what we are calling the spiritual event horizon based upon dependence. So the question for us is not really about Paul and Judas alone. We ask, what do we return to? Where do we go when pressure comes? And which center is gaining weight in our lives? Those repeated returns are forming our trajectories, even now. For the core principle here, we must remember, repeated return forms trajectory. Trajectory becomes reflex, and reflex shapes destiny. Paul could say that he no longer lived, but that Christ lived in him. His governing center had been relocated. And now our brief closing invitation. Judas walked beside Jesus, but Paul learned to abide in Jesus. The difference was not proximity, but trajectory. Not a single moment, but accumulated return. And the same question now stands before us. Which center is quietly gaining weight in our lives? And that brings us to the close of this reflection. We have looked together at the spiritual event horizons of two men, Paul and Judas, and the trajectories that were formed in them over time. My prayer is that this has not only informed the mind, but also invite the heart to consider its own direction, what we are practicing returning to, and which center is quietly gaining weight in our lives. If this presentation has been helpful to you, I invite you to continue exploring the other reflections on this YouTube channel as we think together about spiritual strongevity, the formation of a life that abides in Christ over time and for all eternity. Thank you for spending these moments with me. I'm Peter Murano. Grace and peace to you.